Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I assume that we're all good. I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation. Okay, so when I received the email asking for, saying that the conference was coming on and asking for presentation ideas, I thought, shall I? I'm not sure. So what I'm going to present to you today is deconstructing required practicals. To me, it seems very intuitive, almost like very simple. So, but every time I've used this particular model or this tool, students have really appreciated it, and I've noticed a real big difference in their practical skill level and also then how they go on to answer questions. So I shall get straight on because I know we're on a timer. So tiny bit about me, super quick. PGC 2003. You can read the rest. It's all very exciting, but that isn't really why you're here. So here we go. So AQA's provision when it comes to the required practicals, I know other exam boards will have equivalents. The booklets you get look like this. I know that teachers will, provide their own sorts of resources to support. Different schools will have different designs for the practicals, different equipment, etc. So I was looking for something that would be quite universal for people to be able to sort of get stuck in and use, and also to make the practicals more accessible for students, especially given some of the challenges that we faced recently. So challenges that I perceived, and I should say that in my 6 years doing consultancy stuff, a lot of that, or part of that I spent doing private tuition, so I was still in contact with students and still very much aware of what was going on. And certainly within the past couple of years, although I've now returned to the classroom, working with students through lockdown remotely, I could see the gaps that were growing when it came to practical skill development. So their grasp of content, concepts and context, student understanding of the scientific method, just how practicals works, their experience as well, obviously that suffered due to COVID, etc. And then their understanding of how the required practicals fit into sort of their assessment as a whole. And that's something that I noticed from when required practicals became a thing. I noticed that students, and it's improving now as we're all more used to how they work, but students at first didn't quite get the point of the required practical, certainly at GCSE. So I created, and this is why I think it's kind of obvious, but I created a grid that helps them sort of break it down into 4 key areas that they can focus on when they're planning and analysing practical work. So, I mean, you can read them there. AIM, equipment choices, safety precaution, and maths. So the AIM box is the least obvious of the boxes, because that's where you would put your, depending on what sort of practical you've got, because I'm aware that I'm a physics specialist, but in biology and chemistry, some of the practicals are less investigations and more set procedures and techniques they need to learn. But all of that sort of stuff, the bare bones of the practical, would go in that box. Obviously, equipment choices, why they're made, that is quite a useful box, because that was something that students really weren't that used to doing. They would just work with whatever equipment they were given. So getting them to think about why they were using a particular piece of equipment was, initially a challenge until I kind of made it its own separate thing. Safety precautions, obvious. Maths, this was useful when it comes to thinking about what exam questions are going to be like. Well, the whole grid's useful, but certainly pulling out which practicals had a large maths component made them sort of more aware of those. So accompanying or along with the grid, I would usually use it as a planning tool. So I would usually demo the experiment, showing the equipment that I had available there that they could have access to. Discussions as well, would have class discussions, things including their questions and suggestions. So things like, once they got used to using the grid, they would say things like, so there isn't much maths in this practical then? So no. Or if I use this piece of equipment, or why can't I use this piece of equipment, which, considering where they were coming from and, what I wanted to get out of them by the end of the experience, they were brilliant questions. I was very pleased they were heading that way. I'd show videos. I'm sure people are aware of people like Malmesbury Science or groups like Malmesbury Science who've got all of the required practicals online videos. But again, that exposes them to other equipment options as well. other useful links, etc. You get the idea. I basically immersed them in that practical, and then gave them the task, because again, this planning document was very much their document, their own notes, and they had to pull the important information out. And then, of course, in discussions, we would go through and make sure that they had the right sorts of things down. Ultimately, it's their own work. It's a cheat sheet or a prompt for when they were doing the practical, and then afterwards when evaluating it. So in practice, what did that feel like, or how did it impact their actual practical work? So students were then confident and worked with purpose. So rather than needing to be spoon-fed or needing me to talk them step by step through the practical, they went in there, they got the equipment they needed because they had already planned it for themselves and they knew exactly where it fit into the whole scheme of things. They were able to identify issues and solve them. So if a student did come to me with an issue, it was very much a case of, this is what's happening. I know what I need to do to fix it, but I need a bit of help fixing it, which again was fantastic. They were able to help each other, which meant that my job was very, very easy in the practical. I was able to, and I'm thinking most recently I did this on some of the electricity ones. I was able to concentrate on issues like equipment that was, missing, broken, not working, whatever. So it made my job in the room much more streamlined. So some examples of students using the grid. This is, I think, a year 10 student. So he's chosen to literally get his results in the box at the bottom. He hasn't really talked about what he's going to do with them next, but you can see in red where he's gone in and added to his notes as well. So again, he's listened and taken note of other things that he could do to improve. There's another couple of students here. I think these are year 11 preparing for the required practicals that they know are going to be in their assessment in the summer. There you can see some more examples of how they've used the sections of the grid. The first student there compares different types of equipment, different materials that he's got options of using. He's done a sketch graph in the bottom there in maths. And then the second one, you can see he's rearranged his equation in there. So get the idea there. And then a final one, when they get really au fait with it, they are actually able to draw the grids out themselves, and they don't even need as much prompting as to what goes in each box. And it's really nice when they get to this stage because you know that they're actually thinking about the experiment for themselves. They've made it their own. So after the practical, students were able to analyse their own results because they knew what they needed to do with them. They planned it before, evaluated their work and the practical. They also then, when they went on to have future practicals, they were able to think back to what they'd done already, what information went in which grid, and they were able to make those comparisons. They completed future grids by themselves or with less help from me, less input. And then the outcomes then, as I saw them, and there's a blank grid again, just to remind you of what it looks like. In general, across all students using the grid, I saw increased understanding of the scientific method. So they were engaging with it for themselves rather than just accepting it from me. They recalled and understood the methods, equipment and techniques more clearly. They had an ownership, I think, for me, I think it's these last 2 points, was a big deal because obviously in the exams, I'm not there to answer questions for them. They can't ask their mates. They need to know this information for themselves to be confident in it. And they had ownership over understanding the equipment, the practical, all of it. So, it was their own work, which was, I really appreciated and thought it was brilliant. And the bonus outcome was because of how the grid, the sections it was broken down into, it meant that you could almost predict for each practical, what sorts of questions you were going to get. So if there was a lot of maths, like you had a graph and there were calculations, highly likely that a question on that practical would be focusing on that area. And so just by how populated the grid was, you could almost think about where questions were going to go. And so their ability to answer exam questions, practice questions on the practicals was also improved. So what next? It's over to you, really. I would encourage you, and I've sent Tony a copy of the grid, just go in there, make it your own. Some of the headings, especially the first one, I still haven't quite settled on the best fit heading for that first box. But, tweak it, make it your own. Feel free to do that. And also over to you, are there any questions?
I've got a question that how much time you have dedicated while they're working on the grid? Because if you're considering the time constraint, the time they missed from the school, and then you have got now know the required practicals, you need to know how much time you have actually spent per lesson in terms of the lessons on these grids so that these 10 to 12 marks in the exam are secure.
So I would spend, depending on how used to using the grid. If it was the first time students were seeing the grid, I would spend a good half a lesson just talking them through, setting up, maybe filling one in with them so they've got a feel for what information goes where, and then guiding them through any additional resources that they were using to fill in the grid. I've used this grid with tutees for quite a while, students that I teach, and as they get more and more used to using the grid, that time decreases to the point where I can even set it for homework now, and students will come to a lesson ready to do a practical because they've already planned it out and they know what's going on. They may ask one or two questions just at the start about where to get equipment, etc. But so it seems to work quite well, and certainly time-wise, it's sort of front-loading your investment there. More time at the beginning, and then much less as time goes on.
Your grid, I don't think I see anything about explanation, the description of the experiment. In case they ask them in practical, in the question, how to describe the experiment, your grid only contains the equipment, no explanation of what they've done.
Oh, that would go in the first box. So your method, your steps, the technique that you're doing would go in the first box. So that's what I mean. There's kind of a lot of labels you could give to the first box. I haven't settled on like a final name. But for example, and because the students use them as their own notes, you will find a great variation in how much was written in that section, well, in all the sections. But certainly that would be the one for a student who wanted to write step by step. And we don't really have as many of the procedural ones in physics. Really, they are mainly investigations where you've just got your variables, etc. But I would use the first box for that. But again, as I'm encouraging you to make them your own, if you find a better way to divide and arrange them. But yes, that is a big question area that they could be asked, sort of how to do the practical themselves. But where students can come unstuck there is if they get a question where they're shown a slightly different version of an experiment, and they've only learnt by rote one particular method or technique or using one set of equipment, which is why I encourage them to look at a few different ways and really think about the bare bones of the practical, so they're not phased when they see it done slightly differently. I've talked around that a lot, but hopefully that's answered your question.